Greetings, YouTube. I am currently reading. Let me make sure I get this title right. Where are you? I know you're here somewhere. I just looked at you. There you are. I'm currently looking at Gauntlets and Gaslight, a player's handbook, a player's guide to role-playing in a world of gothic horror steampunk by J. Evans Payne from the Infinium Game Studio. And it is one of the most ambitious statted books I've ever looked at because they've statted every single class that they've designed for this setting for 5th edition, Pathfinder 1st edition, Pathfinder 2nd edition, DCC, and OSR. 5 games. Every class statted. It's quite impressive. But it got me thinking about how, in my view, high fantasy games come in one of 4 settings. Now, steampunk is its own thing. Gothic horror is its own thing. Just like space fantasy is its own thing. For example, like Dragonstar, Starjammer, or Starfinder. Starjammer was my particular uh, preference there. Go take a look at Starjammer. It's awesome. It's based on first edition Pathfinder. Um, it to me is the rightful successor to Dragonstar. It really is. It's very, very good. But when it comes to more classic D&D games or Pathfinder games, but let's face it, people just say D&D when they think high fantasy. I really think that they fall into 4 different distinct eras. And the first is the Golden Age. And the game setting that pops into my head when I think of that is the Morning Star, which was actually a contender to become one of the official settings for D&D, but Eberron won. And that one was still eventually published by the people that wrote it, and it's very good. And it takes place in the Golden Era when the mythic beings still walk the world, when the species, the ancestries that we know in, your standard high fantasy setting, had just begun to differentiate into how we view them today. Gnomes were still very much connected to the Fae. The elves were just beginning to bifurcate into dark elves and light elves. The dwarves were beginning to divide up into different hill dwarves, mountain dwarves, and the deep dwarves, things like that. So it was an era of beginnings. And that is the only high fantasy setting I can think of that kind of follows the classic Dungeons and Dragons model. I think Exalted might also fall into that category, but I tried reading Exalted when first edition came out, and it just didn't gain any traction in my head. Couldn't get into it. I'd be willing to look at it again if anyone has a suggestion about what's the best edition of Exalted to look at. I'm all ears if you'd like to tell me. Um, but that's the only, but Morningstar is the only one I can think of that really captures that golden era. And the second is a setting that is taking place during the strife. Whatever the strife is, it doesn't matter what that particular strife is. The moon has broken up and its rocks are falling onto the earth. The gods have abandoned people. The mages opened up a rift, and things spilled from the sky in the night. There's all kinds of different strifes. But the games set at that moment are usually not quite during the event itself, but usually slightly after, like after the bad thing has made a beachhead. And that's when the strife settings kind of pick up from there. Maybe even 20 years later. But everything is still actively going on. Okay, everything is very much in living memory. Everything's like under 100 years. Okay, so the longer left lived species still remember it. The dragons think it's yesterday. They blame the humans because they probably blame the humans for everything. Um, and even humans remember that their great grandfather or their grandfather was involved in that event. So it's very close to home. And I don't particularly like those kind of settings because I tend to project myself into them, not as readily as I do, say, to games that takes place in the modern world, and there's some kind of strife event, whether it's the return of, vampires, or it's zombie apocalypse, or it's uh, some super plague that wiped out most of humanity, or something like that. I tend to project myself into them, and I go down some very dark paths, and I really don't like to live in those places. I spend enough time living in dark paths. I don't need to add fuel to the fire. So those settings really aren't for me. Then you have the post-apocalyptic zones. These are the types where the event's over and there may be a path of recovery, but things sometimes are, you're walking a hair's edge. Yes, things could recover and get better in the future, or there's the possibility that things could tumble again back into the directly after the stripes kind of thing. Um, while there's not an active conflict going on, there's always the residual elements of it. So there could be machines or monsters or mutants that are still functioning or still being born because of what happened during the strife. And I don't mind those particular settings. I think they kind of have a lot of, they can have a lot of legs and go to do a lot of different things. Um, and I mean, I've played post-apocalyptic based on our world, and I tend to set them about the 200 plus it range so that there's no way I can project myself into them. I would be long dead regardless whether I survive the strife or not. Um, so I don't mind those particular settings. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any that really kind of Earth Dawn makes me think of that. Yeah. Shoot. Everstone, the Blood Legacy. That's the game I'm trying to think of. That is one of the better D&D style games I've seen that really pulled that off. It's kind of like a D&D version of Shadowrun. I mean Earthdawn. Lot closer to the D20 system and much more comfortable, and for folks that like D&D, Everstone is right up there with you. I believe it was based on the D20 Big Eyes Small Mouth rules, but I wouldn't be willing to lay my life down on that one. Um, but I can't think of a lot of others than that. If you could have suggestions, I'm always willing to look at a new setting. I always find them fascinating, even if it's a rule system I don't particularly like. Um, and then you have the far gone era, the ancients. Now these are things that happened 1,000 plus years in the past. None of the elves remember directly. Some of the dragons may, but they're the old ones, the ones that have receded from the world. They don't have much to do with what's going on. Very few beings that are extant remember that age. And I have heard it argued, and I think persuasively, that your classic Dungeons and Dragons setting from the advanced D&D first edition was very much a post-apocalyptic game set in that fourth category that I'm discussing. Because creating new magic items wasn't common. Creating new spells wasn't common. What was common was digging up old spells, digging up magic items and runes and artifacts. You were harvesting the leftovers of buried cities and lost temples and knowledge that had seeped into the past. Now it's just mythic in nature. And you're trying to recover them and bring them into the world of the present, or your classic high fantasy D&D setting. But yes, I think it could be persuasively argued that those settings are post strife, that they are set in an era that is so far in the future that no one even thinks of it as being post strife. They just think of it as the world, and they don't question why there are ancient cities and buried temples and all those things. Um, Actually, would the Aboleths remember? The Aboleths may remember. Maybe even some of the Lithids. They both of those species pass knowledge around in a much different way than we do, which is disturbing that you'd have to go to them to get information. It's not a bargain you want to cut. Um, but in my head, these are the four categories that I think of when I think of high fantasy settings. And I am very much prefer the fourth. That's the one that I'm always very comfortable with. I love the ancient discoveries. I love crawling around inside of stuff. I love coming up with mysteries that have to be, pieced apart, and ancient traps that make no sense that they still work, but by gosh and by golly they do. Um, I also like space fantasy. Like I said, Starjammer. Go read it. You will not be disappointed. Um, even Starfinder, I think, has got some something go for it. Though I don't have any real information about the new second edition that is currently being rolled out, apparently. Um, and I don't know anything about D&D 2024. So Don't ask me questions about that. I know some things about fifth edition enough to know that I think it's a padded uh, playpen that I want nothing to do with. But some of the stuff that's been done for it, I think is quite interesting. And I've read a few of the settings and some of the rules, and I found some of them interesting, even if I want nothing to do with the rules themselves. Stat caps are a goddamn curse from the gods. Um, so let's talk about the different eras as we view them. Do you think I'm really far off the mark? Do you think I've kind of broken them down into somewhat logical categories? And do you have good examples that fall into the four categories that I've mentioned? Because again, I'm always interested in hunting down new interesting things that I haven't looked at before, or maybe even stuff that's in my collection I haven't given a look at thoroughly enough, or haven't read in 20 years, which is quite possible. And now, thanks to the internet, I have a lot of that stuff on digital format, so I can just carry it around my phone if I want, which is very convenient for looking at gaming rules because there's no narrative. I can eat tiny little chunks, a few pages at a time, and have no problem with that. I love digital content for gaming. It is awesome. Um, so let's talk about the different eras of high fantasy and how we view them.